The following program deals with a controversial subject. The theories expressed are not the only possible interpretation. Viewers are invited to make a judgment based on all available information.
This is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into madness.
Open your mind.
And we are back to another edition of West of the Rockies. I'm Frank. Thank you guys for sticking around. I know it's late, but we have a really, really fascinating show for everyone tonight. If you're catching this show on YouTube, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, so you can be notified about all our future interviews. We got some cool interviews coming down the line, so you definitely want to be keeping up to date with that. Our topic for tonight is Bigfoot. My guest is Joshua Cutchin, who wrote this amazing book that I highly recommend everyone get. It's called Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1. In this book, we are presented with evidence from eyewitnesses, investigators, and cryptozoologists worldwide that support the existence of some type of large creature that inhabits the wilderness. We also see Bigfoot in a different light, not only as a physical flesh and bones creature, but we also learn about some of the supernatural events that happen during Bigfoot sightings, like luminescent eyes or orbs of light. In Volume 1, the reader will take a deep dive into how Bigfoot and Bigfoot encounters seem to have connections to other phenomena, like poltergeists, extraterrestrials, magic, fairies, even ghosts. But I think most importantly, the book questions some of the assumptions about what Bigfoot is and could be. This is one of those books that, again, reminds me what a strange and wonderful place the world we live in really is. As mentioned, my guest tonight is Joshua Cutchin, and let me tell you a little bit about him. I'll read from his bio. Joshua Cutchin has appeared on a wide variety of paranormal programs discussing his work, including Coast to Coast AM, Mysterious Universe, and The Gralien Report. He is the author of 4 books: 2015's A Trojan Feast, The Food and Drink Offerings of Aliens, Fairies, and Sasquatch, which has also been translated into Spanish; 2016's The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas; 2018's Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions; and 2020's Where the Footprints End: High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volumes 1 and 2, co-authored with Timothy Renner. Cutchin has been featured on the hit History Channel television show Ancient Aliens and is a recurring roundtable guest on the Where Did the Road Go podcast. Joshua has been invited to speak at Georgia MUFON events, the International Fortean Organization's 2016 and 2019 Fort Fests, and 2019 and 2020 Strange Realities Conference. So here, to talk about his book, Where the Footprints End, is Joshua Cutchin. Josh, thank you so much for being on the show tonight. I really appreciate it. It's a treat for me to get a chance to talk to you about your book, Where the Footprints End, Volume 1. I think people are going to be quite fascinated by what we're about to hear, so thank you for joining us.
Oh, absolutely. Looking forward to it.
You open your book with an account by George Kowalczyk that occurred on October 25th, 1973, at the time when George was 22 years old. And this happened in a rural region outside of Uniontown in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. And I feel like this is a great way to start because this is a great example of all the strange occurrences that seem to happen sometimes when people have encounters with these Bigfoot creatures. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What happened to George back in October of 1973?
Yeah, it's a fantastic story, and I mean that both in terms of being great and also in terms of being fantastical. Comes from the archives of Stan Gordon, who is one of the people who have really sort of brought to everyone's attention the connection between Bigfoot and UFOs. But there was a some farmland in Lafayette County, Pennsylvania, and there was a large glowing orb that sort of descended upon this hilltop where the farm was, and they could hear this loud whirring noise and these sounds of like babies crying or something. So they actually went up to investigate. The owners of the property, they had some guns, some rifles that were loaded with tracer bullets, and they've got this big glowing ball, and from alongside of it, these slow figures are coming forward, and they are big and they're shaggy, and every time they they fire the tracer round, they would sort of reach out to it, and I think they actually said that they hit these things. They are pretty sure because you've got a tracer round, you can tell, and it sounded like somebody throwing something into water, like boop, like a little plop of water every time they hit it. And then all of a sudden, the light just completely goes out, and the things are still standing there, and making these sounds like crying babies. And eventually, they ran away. The interesting thing is, afterwards, Stan Gordon gets a call about this case, and he arrives, and allegedly, according to police reports and whatnot, it was still bright enough at the UFO landing site that you could read a newspaper in the middle of the night there. For some time afterwards, later that evening, Stan Gordon himself claims that he actually saw one of the primary witnesses collapse at the UFO site when they went back out there. And when he came to, he apparently had this vision of the Grim Reaper and the end of the world and all this really apocalyptic imagery. But some other things sort of trailed behind this encounter. Not just that, but also I think there were some batteries that were drained, acrid smells, but there was also some sort of, if memory serves, some Men in Black style activity that was happening as well. There was an individual who, about 2 weeks later, came to the house to question them and said they were, it looked like they were in the Air Force, but they warned him to not share his story, and they never appeared again. This is after they offered to hypnotize him for whatever reason. It might be the strangest Bigfoot case, but it's definitely one of dozens that are out there. I'd probably say hundreds actually that are out there.
It was definitely a great way to start your book, because it's almost like if you have a checklist of weird things to happen, this case seems to have ticked all the boxes.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, apparently George saw some weird lights in the sky, and obviously he sees these Bigfoot-type creatures. I believe at one point he even begins to act possessed in some way, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was when he sort of collapsed to the ground, and he said that he saw this apocalyptic vision. But he also claimed to have had other visions as well afterwards. Part of that precognition, he had visions of an airplane crash. He claimed to have seen the ghost of a dead relative as well. Just all around pretty wild.
Now, what's interesting, when he was visited by these two men, he was also hypnotized, which is, I mean, it's kind of strange for the Air Force and a random guy in a suit to show up to your house and hypnotize you. But apparently they also showed him photos of UFOs and Bigfoots. In your research, do you get the vibe that the government, it's kind of hip to what's going on and they're just really not talking about it?
Well, I seem to be pretty skeptical of how much the government actually knows. I mean, I think that the government definitely has access to better and more data points regarding UFOs, Bigfoot, and things like that. But I really do think that these phenomena are so strange that they really don't have a good grasp on it, because I am now in the camp that UFOs are not aliens and that Bigfoot is not a giant monkey. I think they're a lot stranger having to deal with the way that, like, literally reality works, or that, I hesitate to say maybe even having a spiritual component. Now, as far as those individuals being aligned with the Air Force, he saw them in what he thought were Air Force blues. Hypnotizing people is not exactly Air Force protocol, at least not publicly. They're talking to witnesses. But, it's interesting. You look at these phenomena, and they do sort of have these, gatekeeper figures that sort of show up. So, the Men in Black, the UFO phenomena, a lot of people have thought they might be some sort of government organization, but oftentimes they look just a little bit off, and they behave just a little bit strangely. They'll talk about needing to go recharge, or they won't know how to read certain social cues, or even, one famous example, one of the Men in Black that approached a UFO witness tried to drink a cup of Jell-O instead of using a spoon that he was given. So they sort of seem to be they seem to have more in common with the UFOs than they do government. And similarly in Bigfoot lore, these two apparent Air Force officers, quote unquote, notwithstanding, you do have these two other figures that it's come out recently sort of fulfill the same role as the Men in Black do with UFO reports. Generally, two individuals, one who's shorter and very sort of straight-laced in a black suit, almost dressed like a Men in Black does, except not quite as outdated as they tend to be. And another individual sometimes wearing flannel, or just sort of like a big, tall, really tall biker dude with a big beard that some people have said answers to the name is Bear. And people, will say, oh, these are government agents who are following around and harassing Bigfoot witnesses. And that may be the case, but some of the stories that you read just sound really strange. It sounds almost, again, like these gatekeeper figures are part of the phenomena itself rather than part of the government. A good example of that is one individual who was in the middle of these Bigfoot sightings with a police officer, if I recall, was warned to not intervene by these two figures. And then, sure enough, out on the beat, the police officer runs into one of these Bigfoot, and he pulls his gun, and he's aiming at it, and he just can't bring himself to pull the trigger. And the creature runs off. And he turns around, and there's this tall, biker dude who, alluded that he was with the government, who looks at him and says, couldn't pull the trigger, could you? Good man. It's like, is he following him around, or is he, again, part of this phenomenon, part of the strangeness of the phenomenon? So, does the government know something about Bigfoot? I don't know. If Bigfoot the stranger Bigfoot gets, the less likely I think that the government knows about it. Now, if Bigfoot is something, like a mundane flesh and blood primate, or some sort of, branch of the human evolutionary tree, then I think it's entirely likely that they would have more knowledge of it. But a lot of the things we talk about in the book, in my opinion, sort of lean away from that answer.
That is really interesting. I was not familiar with that. Now, the name of your book is Where the Footprints End. And in your book, you have a story that also happened in Pennsylvania that really kind of exemplifies the title of your book. And that's the story of the Hilsmeier family. Can you tell us a little bit what happened to that family in January 27th of 1978?
So this is a property where something upset the Hilsmeier family of dogs. And the German Shepherds were really upset because there was something out in the back field. The next morning, Alan Hilsmeier and his sons found these three-toed footprints that were in sort of the back field. Each was about 16 inches long and 6 inches wide, and seemed to leave deep enough impressions to indicate that they were dealing with something quite heavy. The stride was about 5 feet from footprint to footprint, even though sometimes it went up hills, and it was about 2,000 tracks. And interestingly enough, they ended right in the middle of the field. Now, of course, the Hilsmeier father saw that this meant that there was a Bigfoot that was backtracking in its own steps, which I don't know how it ever gets out of those steps unless it backtracks over those 2,000 footprints. But this is something that you will run into time and again in Bigfoot folklore. Bigfoot accounts. And accounts of people looking for Bigfoot is that you'll reach the end of this trackway, and it'll be in the middle of a gigantic field, and it'll just stop. Now, a lot of people say, oh, well, the Bigfoot jumped really high or really far to a tree or to some sort of other harder ground where it wouldn't leave footprints. But, I think the largest recorded jumps in the animal kingdom are 50 feet vertical and horizontal for a species of antelope and snow leopards. And sometimes these footprints in fields that are surrounded by much, much, much wider areas of untouched ground than 50 feet. So the implication is that these things just sort of dematerialize, they vanish. Or they walk backwards, which just, maybe, but it just sounds so silly on its face, Some other people suggest that they brush their tracks out, with a branch or something. Which, yeah, okay, but if we're saying that because we insist that Bigfoot is an ape, that doesn't seem like very ape-like behavior. It's not out of the question, but it's just a little bit too elaborate of an explanation. Whereas I just sit here and I say, it disappeared. And I don't know what that means, and I'm not going to tell you what it means because I don't know what it means. But the fact of the matter is, just simply it disappeared. So that was the idea for the title of the book, because the best evidence that we do have for Bigfoot are these footprints, and some of them are magnificent, and they do seem to indicate that we're dealing with a primate. But they are the best evidence that we have, and yet they have only led us to a certain point. So the footprints in that sense have ended, not only in terms of the tracks, but in terms of what they can tell us. So we have to go beyond where the footprints end to folklore instead of science to see if maybe we can gain some additional insight. And, one final statement on the whole footprint thing. These footprints, everything about them really does often, not always, because there's some strange anomalies like different toes and whatnot, but a lot of what these footprints will tell you seems to point to a large undiscovered ape. And people will say, well, that must mean that it's a large undiscovered ape. But at the same time, ghosts leave footprints, ghosts slam doors, it seems like non-physical things can interact with our physical environment. It seems like it's just another variation on that concept.
One question that I wanted to ask real quick in regards to footprints, and this is mentioned in the Hilsmeier case, was that at least I'm pretty familiar with the photographs of these, five-toed, almost human-like footprints. But in the case of the footprints that the Hilsmeier family found, these tracks were made of 3 toes. And it makes me wonder, are there different species of these creatures? Have you found that a certain type of phenomena corresponds to these 3-toed tracks as opposed to like the 5-toed tracks?
Some people have suggested in the past that 3-toed and 4-toed and even 2-toed, if you can believe it, tracks tend to correspond to stranger Bigfoot reports, but that really doesn't seem to hold up. There are plenty of reports that are strange with that have 5-toed tracks left behind, and plenty of reports that aren't strange in any other respect than having odd-numbered toes left behind. It's possible that we could be looking at a different species, but 3 toes is a very distant departure from what we would expect from primate anatomy. I believe, a species of gibbon that has one of its digits fused, but that's about it. And so you've got, 4 instead of 3. Some people will say, oh, it's inbreeding, or, oh, it's injured, but these footprints tend to manifest identically, symmetrically. In other words, the deformity would have to manifest identically on both feet to produce some of these trackways. And, what's more, if you look at these footprints, they don't look like primate feet that are deformed. They look like almost like giant chicken feet or something, with an elongated heel and these 3 equally sized toes splayed out in front. So it seems like something a good deal different than the basic human or traditional Bigfoot set.
I wanted to ask you something because in my limited scope of understanding of the Bigfoot phenomena, I always felt like most of the sightings happened on the West Coast, or at least on the west part of the country, in like the Redwoods area and things like that, Washington. And I was really surprised reading your book that there seems to be quite a lot, and I mean, even that seems like an understatement, but there seems to have been quite a lot of sightings in the Pennsylvania area. Have you yourself had any encounters with this creature?
So my co-author is actually the one who is local to that area, Timothy Renner. But I want to say maybe. So yeah, to circle back around to what you initially said, Bigfoot's been seen in, the going assumption is that Bigfoot has been seen in 49 of 50 states, with the exception of Hawaii, rather. But Tim and I found an account of a wild man in Hawaii that sounds very much like a Bigfoot account. You could find, stories of big hairy giants in Hawaii too. So, yeah, pretty much all 50 states, Canada, South America, Europe, Africa, Australia, they all have their own versions of basically the wild man, the big tall hairy thing that lives in the forest. Pennsylvania is a huge hotspot. There was one point where people like Jerome Clark used to say that, the weirdest Bigfoot stories tend to happen on the East Coast. On the West Coast, they seem like a big ape, and then the farther you drift east, the farther you get into the quote-unquote goblin universe, which is what he called it. But in truth, weird Bigfoot stories happen on the West Coast too, but a lot of Bigfoot stories come out of Pennsylvania. Like, it's easily got to be top 5 states. It's like not top 3 for Bigfoot sightings. And Tim has recorded a bunch of different encounters, and he's had a lot of stuff that's highly suggestive of Bigfoot activity, sort of things that the BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, would call Class B reports, where you have like knocks and strange sounds and vocalizations and strange smells and footprints and things thrown at you, like Tim has experienced. All of that. I, on the other hand, kind of feel like a paranormal kryptonite. I just don't have a ton of stuff that happens to me. However, having said that, I did go out to one of Tim's research areas called Site 7, where he sees a lot of lights, and it's had a lot of the sort of activity that seems to be a lot like Bigfoot activity. Not only that, but also, what would traditionally be called ghost lights, which are orbs of light, floating through the woods, which do seem to have some sort of connection to the Bigfoot phenomenon, as we talked about in Volume 2, where we have that chapter dedicated to lights. But I did go out to Site 7, and we stopped, and the only thing that happened to me was this. As soon as we got out of the car, there was something that was very unhappy with us being there, and it snorted and huffed a couple of times. Didn't sound like a whitetail, because I've heard that. And then it walked away through the leaf litter. You could hear it walking away. This was at night. You could hear it walking away, and it definitely sounded like a 2-foot shuffle. If that was Bigfoot, I don't know. More compelling to me was an experience that I had actually on my honeymoon down here in Georgia, where I live. I was in the Georgia mountains, and we had rented a cabin that was up an extremely steep, rather long driveway. So, for all intents and purposes, less than accessible for somebody wanting to pull a prank. And I was out on the deck the night before we left, and I was I was vocalizing across the valley, making Bigfoot sounds, just being a complete jerk. And the next morning I woke up, and we started loading up the car, and my wife comes to me and says, "Okay, why did you do that?" I said, "What are you talking about?" And she says, "The rock." And I said, What rock?" And I go out to the driveway, and behind one of the rear wheels of my car is this big rock that someone had put there on the size of about a basketball. And I couldn't find where it had fallen from. If it had rolled down the hill, it would have been covered in red Georgia clay, which is not. This is a pretty clean rock, so to speak. Couldn't find anywhere that it had come from. And I don't think that it really would have been anybody playing a prank, because, again, to climb that driveway on the chance that somebody might notice this as a prank, I think you would either make a more obvious prank, or you would just not do it at all. So that's the extent of my Bigfoot experience, unfortunately.
Well, that is still pretty strange. I mean, that's one way to spend your honeymoon is, with a bit of mystery.
Right, I should have known that, right?
Now, it seems like rocks play a big role in a lot of Bigfoot encounters. And when I was preparing for this interview, I was really surprised to find that, as you mentioned earlier, Bigfoot is not limited to the continental U.S. It seems to be like a worldwide phenomena. And I was reading that during the Vietnam War, both sides of the battle, U.S. soldiers and the Viet Cong, they were reporting sightings of some strange, large creature that, when they describe it, it sounded like Bigfoot. Obviously, a lot of the fighting occurred in the deep jungles in Vietnam, and they dubbed these creatures rock apes because they had a habit of throwing rocks. I know in your book you talk quite a length about this rock throwing that occurs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
If you look at, again, I mentioned, the BFRO has these Class B reports, things like, knocking on trees, on smells, vocalizations, footprints, and yes, throwing rocks. If you take a lot of those Class B reports, where people experience all these things but don't actually see a big hairy creature, you take that exact same suite of activity and you put it in the house, it's exactly one-to-one correspondence with poltergeist phenomena. And one of the things that is very common in poltergeist phenomena, and actually common in fairy folklore, and you'll read this in a lot of the old European witchcraft trials, are what's called lithoboly, or throwing of rocks, or the appearance of rocks. In poltergeist cases, they'll drift down from the ceiling, and oftentimes they'll be warm to the touch. There's actually some interesting thermal footage that's been captured in some of these reports in poltergeist cases, where you can actually see like the heat on the rock dissipate after it lands. So why this is interesting with Bigfoot is that, again, these stories of people out in the woods and they get rocks thrown at them. This is places where it shouldn't be a person, they can't see a person, and they assume it's Bigfoot because they're in the woods. But if they were, again, inside a house, they would say it was a poltergeist. This is really evident, however, in this sort of overlap with the Minerva monster case in 1978 in Minerva, Ohio. The Caton family was sort of having a lot of trouble with Bigfoot, and there was a lot of strange Bigfoot activity, not just Bigfoot activity, but strange Bigfoot activity that was happening around their house. And the Bigfoot apparently would walk a ridgeline behind their house and would throw rocks, anything from the size of a pea to the size of a baseball, onto a building. The boys that were there, living in the house at the time, would see a figure walking along the ridgeline, and they would, assume that that's where the rock would be thrown from. So what they did is they started marking rocks with an X on the rock with a marker. And in one instance, they threw it up there, up to where they thought the Bigfoot was, even though they didn't see it in this case. And it got tossed back to them. Same rock, there was an X on it, but it was warm to the touch. Now, the flesh and blood assumption is that, the Bigfoot was maybe holding the rock, and that's why it got warm, but it's important to note that you have these poltergeist cases, a lot of which have a lot of similarities with Bigfoot activity, that also feature these warm rocks being thrown.
It's funny that, you mentioned that, because one of my questions was about that incident about throwing rocks and being warm to the touch.
The reason that I find that really interesting, and, people might sort of be wondering, why is he talking about poltergeist and Bigfoot? There is a significant overlap, not only in the types of things that happen, but also actual poltergeist phenomena alongside actual Bigfoot phenomena. There was an incident in Australia where a family had some property that was plagued with Yowie sightings, which is an Australian version of Bigfoot. And they actually did have straight-up poltergeist phenomena in their home around the same time that they were seeing a Bigfoot outside the home. You have these wood knocks that are so often attributed to Bigfoot that people say, oh, it's Bigfoot with hitting a stick on a tree, and that's how they communicate to one another. But again, knocks and raps inside the house were a sign of poltergeist, and were also a sign of spirit communication and seances of the spiritualist tradition. That was the other time you'd see this sort of poltergeist activity where things were moved on their own. Now, interestingly enough, there were some seances, in centuries past, where people claim to actually see, straight up Bigfoot during the seances. So people would be having spiritual seances to contact dead loved ones or whatever. But they would either, they'd see these hairy hands that would appear, or in one instance from the 1950s, Stan Gooch, who was this paranormal author, saw what he said was either, a caveman dressed in furs, or actually a big furry hairy man. Similarly, in a couple of years earlier, the early 20th century, Fred Kliski was another medium. I believe in Europe, who materialized this big, scary ape. So there's a significant overlap in poltergeist and Bigfoot cases. And, I just don't know what to make of it, other than to say that there seems to be some sort of connection there.
Going down the this path of poltergeist-like activity, there's another aspect to this that you mentioned, which is the disembodied voices. And in the Bigfoot community, there's some very famous recordings that you mentioned in your book called the Sierra Sounds that were recorded by Ron Moorhead and Alan Berry. If anybody hasn't listened to those, I definitely recommend to grab some headphones and listen to those, because it's some really impressive stuff. One thing I wanted to mention is that when you mention wood knocks, we're not just talking about two small sticks being hit against each other. When I was listening to the Sierra Sounds, this sounds like it's a pretty big chunk of tree being slammed down. So whoever is doing this sound definitely is very strong, and they sound quite intimidating. But I wanted to ask about the Sierra Sounds. It looks like a Navy cryptolinguistic listened to this thing, and he said that it sounds like a language, like they're communicating.
Yeah. So the wood knocks that you're talking about, I think the best description of the wood knocks that I've heard is that it sounds like someone taking a Louisville Slugger and hitting a tree, which is like the perfect description. And yeah, so it's pretty intense. There was a crypto-linguist named Scott Nelson who said that there were morphemes, phonemes, and syntax, which almost sounded like, the aspects of language. Meaning that we can't say what it is, but it certainly has the cadence and a lot of the structural similarities that you would expect from an actual language. There was some subsequent analysis of the sounds by some researchers who specialized in vocal cords, and how sort of basically we're able to postulate a correspondence between the height of an individual or the size of an individual and their vocal apparatus. And according to these researchers, whatever made these sounds would probably have to be between 6'4" and 8'2", as terms of the height. As far as Moorhead himself and Barry, I have a lot of faith in those researchers. They seemed, even though I don't agree with everything they say, I certainly think that they're honest and earnest in what they're talking about. So yeah, I don't know what to make of those recordings, but they definitely sound like a language, and it's creepy. It's very confronting when you hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine being out there in the woods and listening to that in the middle of the night, not really knowing where or who's making those sounds. Speaking of being out in the woods, there's an interesting phenomena that seems to happen right before a Bigfoot sighting. And a friend of mine told me a story a few years ago when they were driving up to Oregon, and they stopped by the redwoods at night. And I believe it wasn't that late. It must have been around 10 p.m. And they had an encounter with a ranger. And this woman, she was just kind of asking them where they were headed and all that. And one of the guys in the group then asked her, what kind of animals do you see, this late at night out here? And the ranger replied that, the usual deer, bear, she went down the list. And then the last thing on her list was Bigfoot. So the ranger drives away, and they're just kind of pulled off to the side of the road, smoking a cigarette, when all of a sudden, my friend says that this overwhelming silence rolled in. And one of the things that caught his attention was that it was a full moon that night, and animals are not very quiet during a full moon. He says that at that moment, he just felt this fear he had never felt before. And they all kind of quickly finished just smoking their cigarettes and got back in the car and kept on driving. And it seems that this is something that happens a lot of times right before a Bigfoot sighting. You call this the Oz effect in the book. And you also make a good point that, sure, a lot of animals will become silent if they sense that there's a predator nearby. But you also mentioned that this doesn't account for airplane sounds or other sounds like that. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because this is one of my favorite things to talk about. Yes, the Oz effect was coined by British ufologist Jenny Randall, and she said that it was almost as if people who were experiencing UFO encounters would notice just beforehand that all the sound would stop, and by which she meant ambient sounds as well, not just the sounds of animals, but there was no wind, no airplanes, no no trees rustling, nothing. And then they would see the UFO. And one of the ideas that she sort of threw out there was that maybe it was some sort of pocket reality that was forming around the witnesses. In Bigfoot encounters, this does and doesn't happen to varying degrees. Sometimes you'll have animals fall silent, which, would be completely consistent with them sensing a prey surge around. I'm sure people have been walking outside and silenced crickets themselves. But sometimes, there are these other eerie, unnatural silences. There's an example of an individual in 1967 was basically he was in this preserve named Schiller Woods in Chicago, Illinois, and he had this very harrowing encounter where he ran into a Bigfoot. But he remembered before he ran into it that there was absolutely complete silence. Schiller Woods is 4 miles from O'Hare International Airport. So, the odds of him having any sort of silence for any extended amount of time there is pretty odd. You'll also hear, however, the complete opposite, which is that, there wasn't just silence, but there's also this strange buzzing or ringing sound that sort of comes up. And this is really interesting to me because it's one of those things you see in literally every sort of paranormal account, by which I mean you'll hear people report it at the start of near-death experiences. You'll hear people report it at the start of out-of-body experiences. People will report it at the start of psychedelic trips. People will report it at the beginning of alien abductions. All these things seem to be instigated by this sort of buzzing sound. Not all the time in Bigfoot lore, but enough that it is sort of a minor motif. In one instance, there was a woman who was washing clothes. This is an older account, I believe, in the 19th century. And she was washing her clothes, and she heard some buzzing, and she looks up, and there's this big, hairy wild man. And she averts her eyes because she's afraid he's going to hypnotize her. Because that's what a lot of the folklore talks about, is that these wild men can actually hypnotize you as well, which ties into that sort of psychedelic trip, altered state of consciousness line of thought. So it's just an absolutely fascinating aspect. I don't entirely know what to make of. However, having said that, I did find an interesting corollary. We had mentioned Al Berry in on Moorhead. He wrote a great book called, not originally titled, but it was called Bigfoot. And in it he describes at one of their sites, it might have been a Sierra site actually, but at one of their sites he remembered hearing this ominous singing in the forest, accompanied by some sort of rhythmic drumming and chanting that would sort of float up. And he said that it would sort of started low and guttural, and then it sort of soared, and then it came back down again. And he compared it to some chanting that he heard at a monastery in Japan. I think it was like 1970, late 1970s is when he wrote the Bigfoot book. Now, interestingly enough, the Ainu people in Japan, until 1976, when the last practitioner died, actually would practice overtone singing, which, if anybody is not familiar with that, it's like the tooting throat singing that you see. Where someone sings a pitch and then they use their vocal cords to sound another pitch above it, which is sort of the same concept that you'd find with, like, an Australian Aboriginal didgeridoo. Your lips are blowing a fundamental pitch, and above that you vocalize, and you actually get two pitches, right? That's really interesting to me for a couple of different reasons. Number one, first reason is that, obviously overtone singing is a lot of times used in a spiritual context, but Australian Aborigines will often accompany these altered states of consciousness into the dream time with a didgeridoo to sort of help orally, AURALLY, influence and enhance altered states of consciousness, which you also see, in the out-of-body research community. People like Robert Monroe has put forth this idea of binaural beats, if anybody hasn't heard of it, which are, frequencies that you can put in your ears to induce different states of consciousness. So there's your altered states of consciousness angle in there, but also there is a story, explicitly enough, where an individual who was sort of a Bigfoot enthusiast was out with his son looking for Sasquatch. And he was around the Klamath River, and all of a sudden he noticed his son's eyes glazing over, and his son absolutely collapses. And he said that there was a sound coming out of the tree line, which he compared to a didgeridoo. So that inside the tree line, there was a dark, hairy figure about 15 yards away. He claims that he shot it and took his son to the hospital and said it was a bear attack. But again, here you have this idea of this sort of hypnotizing sound coming from Bigfoot, which ties into altered states of consciousness. And surprisingly enough, my co-author Timothy Renner was actually interviewing a witness on site in Pennsylvania, because he likes to do a lot of on-site interviews. One of the reasons that I like his show, Strange Familiars, so much. And underneath the entire interview, he was only able to isolate a little bit of it. But under the entire interview is this sound that is very much like Susan bird singing. So again, we have this coincidence coming up again that is just absolutely wild. And again, I don't know what to make of it, but it definitely seems to have something to do with altered states of consciousness.
That is really fascinating, because I am a bit familiar with some of the out-of-body experiences and altered states and what people report hearing right before. And some people describe this ringing almost like an oncoming train, that it just gets gradually louder until it kind of peaks at one point. And it makes me wonder, does a witness almost have to be like in tune to a certain frequency in order to not only see a Bigfoot, but, experience some of these other phenomena that occur? One of the things that you mentioned earlier was fairy lore, and I know that through pop culture, the whole idea of fairy has been more associated with like Tinkerbell. However, it seems like fairies are not these cute little creatures that are flying around. Bigfoot, I guess, would be a type of fairy. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay, well, so before anybody turns off the interview, wait. So fairy lore has been greatly misunderstood over the past several centuries, probably since Shakespeare on, is when it really started getting cute and Disney-fied. But fairy folklore is a worldwide set of beliefs that there are beings that like to abduct people, that are intimately connected to the earth, sometimes, quite often actually, associated with the human dead. And oftentimes they are short in stature, but not exclusively short in stature. So you have this body of folklore that is actually quite chilling if anybody wants to look into actual fairy mythology. It's really interesting. It's all about taking babies and replacing them with fairy changelings. It's just being kind of capricious, I guess is the best word, but nasty when they want to be. So people will say, well, what is this? What do these tiny little fairies have to do with Bigfoot? But time and again, you'll read in all these fairy stories, not fairy tales, right? Not fairy tales, fairy stories about fairies having the ability to change size and shape. To the extent that, some fairies were explicitly large, like giants and trolls, which are sort of in that sort of fey folk family, share a lot of the same attributes. But you also have stories of basically big hairy fairies in the form of the Wadlows, which is sort of a European wild man that exhibited a lot of fairy attributes, but, for all intents and purposes, it's like Bigfoot. And they had a lot of these magical attributes as well. Moreover, if you look at some of the Scottish brownie folklore and the analogs to that folklore, so we're talking about the Pekandillen in Germany or the Goblins of France. They were tiny, monkey-like fairy people. And sure enough, a lot of the contemporary sightings of fairies are not only, what we think of as traditional leprechauns or people in, little people in vest and jacket or whatever, but sometimes they're these little, short, hairy creatures that people say are fairies, and they definitely line up with tiny little versions of Bigfoot. Not only that, but a lot of the attributes that you'll see attributed to Bigfoot are shared in fairy folklore. Because they're also shared with alien folklore, and alien folklore also corresponds very closely to the fairy folklore. But one of the things that I find very interesting, specifically, is how a lot of times researchers will say that Bigfoot are fond of braiding horses' manes. Now, realistically, a lot of these braided horses' manes are probably people's horses who did not get brushed before being put up the night. But nonetheless, people do say that Bigfoot braid horses' manes, and I've seen some pretty intricate, quote-unquote, braids presented as evidence that I find interesting. People don't see this happen a lot, but according to them, Bigfoot will sneak into a barn at night and braid horses' manes. There is one account that I found of a Russian researcher who found an almas who he said walked into a stable and braided horses' hair. Almas or Almasy being the Russian version of Bigfoot. But what's interesting about this regarding fairies is that you see that exact same behavior. So, coming into your stable at night and braiding horses' hair attributed to witches and fairies in Europe. The idea in Europe was that the fairies would actually braid horses' manes as teeth of stirrups to go out and ride around at night while the human beings slept. So I find it really interesting that we attribute that same sort of observation, whether or not it's actually genuinely anomalous or not. People run into these odd things with their horses' hair, and 100 years ago in Devon, you would have said, "Oh, it's the fairies," and yesterday in Montana, you'd say, "Oh, it's Bigfoot." I find it really interesting.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, and I recently have started kind of going down the path of researching a little bit more about the fairy folklore. And it's funny because it also seems to be a bit of a worldwide phenomena. And I'll tell a quick story. Many years ago when I was a child, my family was vacationing down in Mexico. And the neighboring family of where we were staying at was this lady who had 3 sons, and I think my estimate is that their ages were probably like 7, 12, and 16 at the time. And I remember after a couple of days, we found ourselves having a talk with her, and she began to tell us this strange tale that she said that one night she woke up because her youngest son was basically being kidnapped by these small little men. The way she described them, they sounded almost like elves. And she says that she had to fight them off to keep her child, and that they would come around every so often. It's obviously an unbelievable story. And the more I'm looking at this whole folklore of fairies and what you mentioned of wanting to take children and even young women, you have to start to reconsider, what these people are experiencing could very well be true. Now, in the case of Bigfoot, it's funny, my same friend who told me this story about driving up to the Redwoods and just hearing the silence, one of the guys in the group that he was traveling with, who was local to that area, said that there was a friend of his who chose to live away from the city. He didn't want to live in the city anymore. And he was out there in the woods one night, just kind of camping, and he fell asleep inside his sleeping bag. And he says that next thing he knows, he's being carried away in his sleeping bag. And he was, a few feet off the ground, and he felt like he was clearly being carried over someone very large over their shoulder. he struggled a bit and he was dropped to the ground. And he says when he unzipped his sleeping bag and got out, he saw a very confused Bigfoot standing in front of him. And they both kind of darted in the opposite direction. I find that really interesting because obviously it seems like Bigfoot is quite an elusive creature, but there seems to be reports of these very, very close encounters with humans, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that you'll see, especially in a lot of indigenous folklore. You know, we're using the term Bigfoot to sort of describe all manner of wild men seen throughout the world, but, focusing just here on the U.S., you'll see in indigenous folklore all the time. They would take women and they would take children, either for breeding purposes or for food. That taking them for breeding purposes, I mean, that's the exact same thing that you see in fairy folklore and, the alien abduction experience. It really is amazing the similarities between these things once you start digging down a little bit deeper. And that's where a lot of my work tends to focus is on, I don't think that aliens are fairies or Bigfoot are fairies or that fairies are aliens or anything like that. I don't think that any one of these ways that we describe this phenomenon, I don't think any of those are accurate. I think they're all describing the same thing in their own sort of way, and that we really don't have the tools to accurately describe it. It's real, and it's objectively not... It's real and it's objectively unnatural in some way, at least in terms of the way that we perceive the world. I'm close to saying that it's not us, but I don't want to say that because it might be some sort of projection of us, right? Some sort of tulpa or thought form or something like that. But there's something genuinely strange going on, and we, depending on where we are in our culture, just find different ways of describing it. And, kidnapping is one of those things as well, where people... sometimes it's missing 411 style activity. Sometimes it's a way of coming to grips with, as in a lot of the changing folklore of Ireland, it's a way of coming to grips with children's developmental disabilities. A lot of that changing folklore is about that, I think. But I do think at the same time that some of it is just trying to describe this weird interaction that we have with this other reality.
Speaking of interactions with another reality, you write about a story that happened in 1857 that kind of goes further into this fairy folklore similarities, which involves a boy being kidnapped and taken underground. Can you just tell us that story really quick and just further expand on these similarities of the fairy folklore?
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because I absolutely adore this story. It's from the June 9th, 1857 issue of Salem, Oregon's Weekly Oregon Statesman. And it's a story about this boy who was out looking for livestock with an older gentleman, and they were camping in the forest, and they heard this cry in the woods. And the boy woke up that night, and he saw a large, hairy man about 12 or 15 feet tall, whose eyes were glowing, quote-unquote, like liquid balls of fire. And it grabbed the boy and ran away into the forest to a trap door. And it opens up this trapdoor in the forest and climbs down a ladder into the subterranean lair. Inside, the boy sees this room that's illuminated with a peculiar phosphorescent light. And above it, it all seems to be composed of like seashells of every conceivable shape and color, he said. And he could hear music coming from somewhere else. And according to the story, the creature ended up bringing back a young lady who was, absolutely beautiful. And she hands him a card, like a business card. And it says, boy, depart hence forthwith, or remain and be devoured. And he ends up escaping while the beast is sleeping. What I love about that story is, it sounds like a Bigfoot, right? I mean, it's Oregon, it's large, hairy man with these glowing eyes, but everything else about the story is straight out of fairy lore. I mean, that sort of weird lighting is just like the dim lighting of fairyland. You could draw some comparisons to the sort of underground dome space that people see in D&T trips and the seashells. But that detail about the girl who comes and warns him to leave you find that time and time again in these stories of people who are kidnapped by fairies in Ireland or the British Isles, or people who stumble into a fairy party and they'll see someone who walks up to them, and it's a young girl who died last year, and she tells him to not drink any food, try not drink any drink or eat any food, or else they'll be trapped with the fairies forever, like she is. It's an exact comparison there. And so I absolutely love that story.
It was really fascinating to read, absolutely. And just to kind of make one further connection here, you just mentioned DMT. And, for the folks at home, definitely, if you don't know about that, give it a Google search, dimethyltryptamine. It's very fascinating. Many years ago, when I first started doing this show, I interviewed someone who was a self-taught shaman, if you will. And he was fairly young, but, he seemed to have a really good handle on a lot of these topics. And one of the things that he described to me was we were actually talking about fairies and just other dimensions. And he mentioned that one time through meditation, enter this fairy realm. And when you mentioned DMT, it reminds me of this. Is because the way he was describing this process of meditating and what happens sounded very similar to what happens during a psychedelic trip. And I know that talking to people like Dr. Rick Strassman, he believes that you can achieve these same altered states that you enter with DMT through meditation. So he was telling me that he was in this fairy realm, but that these creatures that he encountered were surprised to see him there, and they kind of kicked him out right away. It was a totally strange tale. So I almost have to flirt with the idea that do we have to be like in tune to be able to see with, I don't want to get too mystical here, but almost to see with like our third eye and see some of these creatures like Bigfoot or aliens or fairies, which in your book, you do an excellent job at showing the similarities and showing how there could be some type of connection between all of these.
I mean, yeah, that's sort of the frustrating thing. It's because I want to see these things too, but you keep on running into stuff like, oh, you don't see fairies with your eyes, you see them with your heart. It's like, okay, that's great. What does that mean, But I think you're right. I mean, I'm convinced that the altered state of consciousness angle has something to do with it. You're right. You can achieve it by a lot of different ways. You can achieve it through, psychedelic entheogens. Let's say that's a better word, better way of putting it. So certain substances you can achieve it through meditation. Substances are quick, but you're unprepared for it. Meditation is a lot slower, but you tend to arrive much more prepared for what happens to you. I think some people are just born with it. I think other people are sort of forced into it by trauma or by dissociation. And I think that's why we see the same sort of imagery popping up in near-death experiences. But I do think that there's something, so much of this paranormal stuff comes back to the witness. It comes back to the person and what they've got going on in their lives. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to people who were talking about a UFO sighting that they had. And I said, well, what was going on in your life? And they're like, well, I was in the middle of a divorce, and we were renovating the house at the same time, or something like that. Right. There's always this transitional, liminal aspect to a lot of these things, and I think that something about being in that state of mind is really conducive to these phenomena. But yeah, I'm always thrilled to explore where the Venn diagram overlaps on a lot of these phenomena, and man, Bigfoot sits at the middle of a lot of it, that's for sure. You can draw comparisons, as we do in the book, to Bigfoot and ghosts, Bigfoot and UFOs, Bigfoot and fairies, Bigfoot and witches, Bigfoot and these archetypal women in white. I mean, it really is the gift that keeps on giving.
One of the things that caught my attention was that it seems a lot of this phenomena is a bit localized, like, for example, in the Pennsylvania area or like here in California up in the Redwoods and, Washington State. And when I was reading your book, there was a lot of instances where, if the listeners are familiar with Skinwalker Ranch, I mean, this is a pretty fascinating spot where you see lights, you see Bigfoot-type creatures, you find mutilated cattle. There's a story about a family that moved there that within a few days, I believe, they saw this large black wolf just kind of walking through the field. And it makes me wonder, in fairy folklore, you hear a lot about enchanted forests. And it makes me wonder if maybe this phenomena, if there are basically hotspots in different parts of the world where, these things happen with more frequency. Have you found that in your research?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that these things can happen anywhere, but there are certainly some places where they are more likely to happen. And, as to why, we could speculate all day. Some people will say, oh, it has to do with ley lines, or, oh, it has to do with, burial grounds, or this or that or the other. But I kind of wonder if it's not all of the above, and sometimes other things, and, it's almost like there's a critical threshold that has to be reached, and if you reach that by having a huge amount of quartz deposits in the ground, then congratulations, your area is paranormal. If you reach that by, having, some quartz and some burials in the ground and some running water underneath the ground or whatever, people put forth all sorts of different ideas and things as paranormal attractors, then congratulations, you have a paranormal area. So I think there might be a combination of factors, and not just any one thing. But yeah, I do think that there are areas. You look at a place like where Timothy lives, and it's Weirdo Central. I mean, you've got, I think just within 30 miles of where he lives, you've got leprechaun sightings and UFO landings and Bigfoot encounters and haunted houses and these things called albatwitches, which are like these little hairy creatures as well. You've got all these different things in one area, and that's sort of was the inspiration for one of Timothy's essays in the book, which is the company they keep. Which is, I said to him a while back, I said, Tim, you have to look at the company that these things keep. I think it's not at all coincidental that people see UFOs over Loch Ness, and Aleister Crowley built his Boleskine house on the shores of Loch Ness, where people see the Loch Ness monster. I mean, it's just coincidental, right? I mean, I think that you get too many of things happening in one place, and you've got to say, okay, yeah, it's these things do seem to be related, and they do seem to be attracted to certain factors.
One of the things that I found interesting reading your book was that there was an instance, there's a story in your book that you included about someone having a Bigfoot encounter, and they began to call out the name of Jesus, and this creature went away. And I'll be honest, it's not the first time I've heard of something like that in alien encounters. I've read quite a few cases where people have called out to Jesus for help, and the encounter will end. Obviously, getting into religion is a tricky area when talking about all of these things. But the obvious question is, are these things evil in some way? And is that the reason why they behave in this manner when a witness will call out the name of Christ, for example?
That's a great question, and it's a needle that I constantly find myself having to thread. Because I am a Christian myself, and at the same time, I get sort of frustrated with this idea that everything has to be good or evil. I think that there are a lot of freelancers in the middle. Sometimes I think that a lot of these things are predisposed to have negative consequences in your life. I think that some people that I know have said about the spirit world, it's a lot like going into the ocean. A shark is going to shark. A shark might bite you, or a shark might end up killing you from a bite. Doesn't mean that it's evil. It's just it's just in its nature. Similarly, you might run into sharks that are better dispositioned, or sharks that run away. But you're right. I mean, the thing that all these communities have to address and confront is the fact that people can pray and get out of supernatural encounters, and not just Christianity. Although that's probably the best documented, but I've seen stories of atheists who suddenly start praying and are able to dispel what's ever going on around them. I found an instance of a Muslim gentleman who believed that he was being attacked by jinn, which are sort of fairy analog kind of alien abduction scenarios as well. But he was praying to Muhammad, and he was able to repel And you find it in Bigfoot stories. And of course, you certainly find it in hauntings as well and fairy folklore. So, I don't know what that means. I have some friends who think that it doesn't necessarily indicate the supremacy of one religion over another one, that it just means that the intention behind what you're doing is what counts. I'm certainly open to that idea. I kind of remain, I remain agnostic to what that means. But it is definitely something that happens. So if you're ever in a scenario, you can pray and sometimes get the results of being brought out of that scenario.
I think one of the best explanations for this, or at least one of them that kind of coincides with what you said, that, it doesn't necessarily have to be evil. Like, we don't have to see things as good or evil. I remember someone was saying in regards to alien abduction experiences is that these entities are respectful, and when they see a person doing that, it's just a form of respect of like, okay, you clearly don't want to be here, so we will leave.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that in order for a lot of these things to make sense and not to be clouded by any bias, we should hold off the judgment of, are we dealing with good or evil? But I do agree that intention plays a big role in a lot of these type of experiences. Your book, Where the Footprints End, it's actually not a standalone book. This is actually volume 1. There's a volume 2 out there. Can you tell us a little bit about what you cover on that book?
Well, volume 1 and volume 2 are roughly divided into folklore and evidence. So that's a bit of a misnomer because there's a good deal of evidence in volume 1 and a good deal of folklore in volume 2. Volume 1 does talk about sort of the things that we've been talking about, looking at Bigfoot through the lens of witchcraft or folklore with fairies, poltergeists, the alien contact experience, gift offerings, ghosts, and some certain archetypes involving women and white. Volume 2 is evidence because it's a little bit more experiential in terms of what it focuses on. So in Volume 2, we have mystery lights, which we separate from UFOs. But UFOs. So we have a chapter on alien abductions, a chapter on mystery lights, and a chapter on UFOs, which we sort of did because topics overlap so much. So Volume 2 is mystery lights, UFOs, vocalizations, because a lot of these Bigfoot vocalizations are just uncanny in the way that they mimic other sounds. I would say unnatural in the way that they mimic other sounds. Altered states of consciousness, hex signs, toes, the different numbers of toes that we were just talking about, trackways that are anomalous, so trackways that just end, Bigfoot, Bigfoot phasing through material, Bigfoot gliding, Bigfoot levitating and flying away, one-legged trackways, portals and stuff like that. Like that's where that all falls there. Disappearing evidence, which is the chapter by my co-author Timothy about how Bigfoot evidence just always seems to disappear. The trickster phenomena, and then 2 case studies that exemplify a lot of the things that we've been talking about, sort of all in 1 or 2 cases.
That sounds really, really wild. I look forward to reading that next, and hopefully you can come back on the show and we can discuss, because I'll tell you, I know that in your volume 1 of Where the Footprints End, you don't want to compare your book necessarily to Jack Vallee's Passport to Magonia, but I kid you not, I got the same vibe reading your book, in the sense that we can't limit ourselves to one theory when we don't have an answer to what's going on. And I think that it's very important to look at all of this with an open mind, to try and really understand, or attempt to begin to understand, what's happening and what people are seeing and experiencing. And what I loved about your book was that it made me, and I know I say this a lot when I read these type of books, but I mean it, it just makes me realize how strange and a wonderful place the world is that we live in.
No, I completely agree, and that's very kind of you to say, and I don't think we ever really intended for it to have that sort of Vallean shape, but it kind of took that on, I think, and if we can just encourage the conversation in this direction, again, as we were talking about a little bit before we started, even if it's the wrong direction, at least it's a different direction for a while, and we can see what its shortcomings are, or maybe what its strengths are. Absolutely.
Where can people get your books, Josh?
If you go to my website, joshuacutchin.com, JOSHUACTCHIN.com, I have links to all my books, including these two. They are exclusively available on Amazon because they are printed through Amazon. So you can go to Amazon.com and type in Where the Footprints End, and you'll find volumes 1 and 2 there. But if you can order them from, a brick and mortar traditional bookstore, that'd be great, because I do love myself bookstores and I love to see them.
Thanks so much, Josh, for being on the show tonight. I really appreciate it. This has been a great deal of fun and just mind-opening, mind-expanding, and I definitely wish you luck in all your future research.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
That was Josh Cutchin, author of this really amazing book, Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 1. I definitely encourage you guys to go grab a copy of this book. You won't be able to put it down. It was an amazing experience to be able to submerge yourself in this world and just explore the possibilities. I can't wait to start their second book, Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, Volume 2. Like I mentioned there towards the end, these two books make the whole work. Josh and his co-author Timothy did a great job in Volume 1. Can't wait to see what they did in Volume 2. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview. I know I did. We definitely covered a lot. Let me know your thoughts. Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. If you have any questions, we'll have Josh back here in the near future, and I'd be happy to pass those along. If you're catching this show on YouTube, don't forget to click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications, and stay up to date with all our interviews. We got some other cool stuff coming down the pipe here. Also, don't forget to check out the website, WOTRradio.com. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at WOTR Radio. And of course, you can go like our Facebook page, facebook.com/West of the Rockies. That being said, take care, be safe, God bless, don't do anything too crazy. We want to see you back next week. Until then, bye-bye.
West of the Rockies with Frank the Engineer on the Independent FM, Los Angeles.